What's up everyone, Alex here. So I recently celebrated my 45th birthday back on June 1st of this year, and this kind of gave me an idea because I kind of see like 45 as really like a big milestone. But also, I've been talking to a lot of you over the past several years where some of you have expressed concern about aging and gaming. And so I wanted to kind of make this video to share with you my experiences gaming in my 40s. Because let me tell you this, like I've had a ton of fun over the past several years, even when I was in my 30s. But there's something about being 40 that is just hits different compared to like all the other decades that I've gamed, and maybe it has something to do with getting older and knowing a lot more, but I don't know, like I think I need help trying to nail it down, like what that is. And thankfully, you all sent me so many really awesome questions in the community tab where I posed the question about gaming in your 40s. And a lot of you shared your experiences in gaming in your 40s, or even like your mid to late 30s, or even early 30s as well, especially because, you know, responsibilities loom. And as far as those responses go, let me know if you want to see a video about people's responses and how the community responded to that, because I think there's some really good tips for people who are kind of concerned getting older, so to speak, and being able to keep up with gaming. But for this particular video, I want to talk about my experience gaming in my 40s because it is similar but different than most, given that I am a content creator. And like I said, I'm going to go over a lot of your questions. And again, thank you so much for all of these wonderful questions. And I just kind of like just grouped them together because some of the questions are kind of similar and I want to answer them together. And some of your questions actually also provide great context as to some of the other questions. I'm saying questions a lot, but you get what I'm saying. And of course, if you want me to elaborate on any of the answers that I had in this video, please let me know in the comments below, because I do want to help a lot of people out, especially to kind of get back in the fun of games, right? And level it up, so to speak. So hopefully you enjoy this video, and if you do, like, share, and subscribe so that we can continue doing this. So anyways, let's get started. So the first question that I personally want to tackle is, why do you still game at 40, and do you think you'll continue to play games the older you get? Put it in another way, another question asked, do you still feel the magic? And it's actually a very interesting question because I've thought about this a lot, and I think one of the reasons why I still play video games is because there are new experiences that come out like every single week. And while you can kind of simplify and oversimplify it to like, oh, it's a platformer, oh, it's a JRPG, oh, it's this and that, there are a bunch of different ideas that can come out of it that are simply just numerous, especially when you compare it to something like TV or movies. And keep in mind, like, I love watching TV, I love movies and whatnot, but the element of interaction is something unique in video games that just they can't have. Right? Like, they've tried, and you're a passive observer in those media, whereas in video games, you're actively participating in what's going on screen. And there's something really special about that. And I think that that's one of the reasons why, even though I'm going to get older and stuff, I'm still going to play video games. I actually joked around with people saying that I'm going to be like Britta. I'm going to be like in my 60s and 70s, still making videos on YouTube talking about video games. And you know what? I still look forward to that. Like, I really genuinely look forward to, like, you know, what is it now? I'm 45, like over the next 25 to like 30 years, like making videos on YouTube and talking about the latest video games. Because as you'll see, as we get down further into this question list, there are ways that people are figuring out how they can allow people to enjoy different sorts of games, even though we don't have the same eye-hand coordination and reflexes that we had when we were younger. So stay tuned for those questions. The next question is, how do you make time for gaming in your 40s? What's it like balancing your gaming time and other real-life things? And how do you manage time with family and work? So, as I said, this is my full-time job, being a content creator. And while it doesn't pay all the bills yet, I am working towards it. And the way that I treat work, just to kind of really quickly touch upon this, is that I don't really think of it as work. I think of it as a conduit for my creativity. You see, like, I actually started YouTube all the way back when Johnny, Happy Console Gamer, started in 2009, but I abandoned it because I had other pursuits and I had other interests. Like, I tried to make a gaming website, I tried to make a podcast, and while they were successes in their own right, that kind of informed me that what I really love doing is making videos. So here I am back like several years later. I started back in 2017. I started putting like podcast episodes on here and then, just started doing these kinds of videos. So as far as work goes, I kind of incorporated video games into my work. My work is video games and reviewing is my work. That said, the playing of the video games isn't the work, right? So I'll get into that some other time, but because video games are my work, it's easy for me to kind of schedule around hanging out with my wife, for example, who is also a gamer, by the way. So we kind of play a lot of games together, especially games that I have for review. And I also ask her a lot of questions about the games that I'm reviewing. So for example, we had a really long conversation about our experiences playing Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth a few weeks ago, leading up to the review that I posted. And I find that having those conversations and sharing those experiences with my wife actually make it such a fun experience. Even though that, for example, that's a single player game, we're able to connect on the level of like, hey, what did you think of this game? What do you think of Ichiban's story in this game, for example? And also, games like Unicorn Overlord and so on and so forth. So my family and I, including my cat, I suppose, who's credited at the end of every video, we all kind of share and partake in this, amazing hobby that, I'm just really thankful that I'm able to do that. Obviously, there are chores, we schedule for that. We set aside time for those things. And I think if there's only one takeaway that I want you to have is to make time for the things that you love, because no one else will, right? And there are ways to keep playing video games. There are 24 hours in a day. A lot of people have said like, hey, I play video games like after my wife sleeps or when the kids go to bed or something like that. It is possible. And it is possible to still play like longer games too, believe you me. The next question is interesting. So it says, do you prefer playing older games on their original hardware, or do you prefer emulation like in HD remakes? So this is interesting because I've always kind of considered myself an old school gamer. So ideally, I'd play them on original hardware. But the backwards compatibility in modern systems has allowed me to play a lot of the games that I would normally bust out like an old console for, and I think that's really great. I rarely, if at all, go back to original hardware because, for one, like, I have to dig through the garage or boxes and stuff to find like where those consoles are. There was a time, like early to mid 30s, that I had all my consoles hooked up, and then I started to realize like I barely use any of these. They become like museum pieces because they're just kind of hanging around and collecting dust. And you want to talk about chores, like having to clean all that stuff and dust them, that's kind of a pain in the butt. So I prefer playing a lot of games on modern consoles these days, but I can tell you now, like right here, physically, I have my PS3 that is the original 60 gigabyte model at launch that is fully backwards compatible all the way to the PS1, still hooked up here, along with like a base PS4, and I have like a PS5 downstairs, and that's where I usually play a lot of my games. But these consoles are right here, ready and willing to take on any PlayStation game that I'm gonna put on there, because I still have a lot of PS2 games that I want to play too. And it's funny because I actually, hang on, let me grab here. I actually have a copy of Manakemia right here, like ready and willing to go. Like, the disc is literally in the PS3 over there, so I can totally just like start playing that game whenever I want. I remember kind of starting it like 2 years ago, but I got pretty far. I have some footage of it, but admittedly, I need to get back to it. Okay. What do you do when you're having gaming fatigue? Like, you had a ton of great games in your library, but you have no desire to play any of it. So these are actually two very different questions and statements, because gaming fatigue isn't necessarily caused by the great games that you have on your backlog. So I'm going to address each of these individually. The reason why there's gaming fatigue is due to burnout, and burnout is usually caused by playing similar games or the same styles of games back to back to back. Because what usually happens is that they blend in so much because they have so many similar elements that you know everything just kind of bleeds together, and so there's no real variety of experience. As far as having no motivation to play great games in your backlog, I think a lot of that is analysis paralysis or choice paralysis. It's like, sure, you have all these great games, and I think a part of your thought process is thinking like, why aren't you playing all these amazing games? It's almost like guilting you, and that's a mental thing that you have to kind of really think about. And I think the best way to treat backlogs like that is to not think of them at all. In fact, it's the same kind of advice that I would give somebody when they're facing gaming fatigue, because gaming fatigue is all about doing the same thing over and over. So what do? You don't do the same thing over and over. You either play a completely different genre that you've never, ever, ever tried before, or a long time ago, or maybe do something else like watch movies, TV shows, or in the backlog's case, well, just play what you want to play. At the end of the day, that's really why we play video games, is we want to be entertained, we want to be fulfilled, and we want to have a lot of fun. And I think that statement alone is, I think, the best way to encapsulate, the experience of playing games. I know that sounds really obvious for a lot of people, but it's actually not. And I think it needs to be said again, and I think some of you need to hear it again. So hopefully that helps you out. So the next question, how does the state of gaming differ from how it was when I was younger? So I think that there was a lot of creativity back in the day when it comes to making video games, because technology was exciting, because nobody has really tried to push the envelope of technology before. And so back in those days, a lot of onus was put on the types of interaction that you have with games. And that led to a lot of experimentation and, of course, drawbacks and flaws. Like, I remember back in the day where, especially in arcade games, they were designed to have difficulty where they know that you have to hit continue every single time to eat up your quarters and stuff. And that's part of those early game designs. That's also because we didn't have a refined vocabulary of how games should play and should behave. And I think if there's any one thing that we need to pay attention to, is that over decades and years, we've actually continuously refined the vocabulary of games. And what the hell is a vocabulary of games? Well, think about a platformer. Obviously, there's going to be a jump button, there may be a run button, or some sort of attack. There is a set expectation of how a particular game is. Each genre has its own vocabulary, right? Like first-person shooters have an aiming reticle. You can probably toss grenades. There's different kinds of grenades. That's kind of vocabulary to me. And I think we're kind of getting back to that experimentation again, because you're getting like really good games like Hades. And Hades has been on my mind for the past several weeks because Hades 2. And I never thought that I would like roguelikes, and that's a great example of a roguelike that is very approachable. And there's a question that addresses what I just said just now, but we'll get to that later. But in general, I do think that gaming is cyclical, right? Like, there are things that come back, there are things that kind of quiet down, but there's always room for old genres to either return or new genres to be created. We are still very much early on in video games, even though we've been around for decades now at this point, because of the interaction element. It's been really amazing just seeing the change in video games in such a short span of time, because I think that 45 years is still a short span of time, especially when compared to movies and TV. So yeah, I'm just loving it right now, like all the things that have grown out of video games and how video games have evolved. So it's been really, really cool to see. Have your skills and reflexes changed over the years? Were there any games that you got better at, like strategic decisions and turn-based combat? And do you find that you're able to play games that you couldn't before? So I have a very unique perspective on video games because I never really seek out reasons why I shouldn't play certain things. I think growing up, I kind of found out that there are just games that at that moment in time, I'm just not into. But when I come back to it later, I somehow knew that my opinions of them would change. So a really good example of that are tactical RPGs. Like I'll just say it now, I hated tactical RPGs. Like I would play some from time to time, but I was more of like a real-time strategy gamer than a tactical turn-based gamer. So things like Valkyria Chronicles, for example, I discovered very much later on because I think for me, and I mentioned this in my how to get into tactical RPGs video, I thought to myself, the battles in tactical RPGs are long. They're like 20, 30 minutes compared to like a JRPG where you have like small chunks of like 3 to 5 minutes. And then, of course, somebody basically recontextualized it with me and said, like, if you consider a tactical RPG battle as like an inclusion of both the time it takes for you to do a dungeon run and all the battles, it kind of balances out. And I've always appreciated that definition. But to go back to the other questions, which is, have your skills and reflexes changed over the years? Of course they have. There's a reason why boxers are asked to retire very early on because their reflexes are just slower. But I think a lot of people put too much stock on the fact that a lot of video games these days are fast-paced and therefore inaccessible to people. In fact, I talked earlier about like game design evolving over the years and also the vocabulary of games kind of changing over the years. And I think a lot of people who are designing games are aware that they cannot simply rely on reflexes to deliver fun experiences. There needs to be ways to balance things out and to lift other players in such a way that it would allow everybody, regardless of age and reflexes, to be able to enjoy games. To give you an example, Overwatch as a game, as a squad-based game, tried its best to capture the spirit of playing 90s shooters, but also lowering the barrier of entry, so to speak, by introducing weapons and armor and guns and powers that can mitigate people's weaknesses. And I think that's one of the reasons why I love RPGs of all sorts, including action RPGs, is because there are ways for you as a player to mitigate a lot of your own weaknesses using the different mechanics that they introduce. And also one of the reasons why I love games like Tales of Arise, which of course was like one of the first action RPGs that I played in a long time, that actually managed to figure out how to make action gameplay without making it so inaccessible. Another genre that I've actually gotten into that I really realized that I don't know, like I didn't expect it to, was the Souls series. It's specifically Elden Ring. And no, this is not an ad for Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree, but I made a lot of assumptions about the genre, like, oh, it's supposed to be hard, and then I did a lot of research on its maker and stuff, and it made me realize, like, no, it's just trying to capture that same old school, like, 8-bit feeling, 8-bit, 16-bit feeling of playing games back in the day. And so when I approached that and I started playing Souls-likes, I was like, oh, I got it. I understood what it's all about. But more importantly, and this is something that a lot of you have many misconceptions on, you don't need fast reflexes to play Souls-likes at all. You just need to be able to respond. It's kind of interesting because we're talking about like vocabularies earlier, and one of the vocabularies of Souls games is that if an enemy is too fast and you're trying to retaliate right away, then you're doing it wrong. It's almost like a turn-based game of sorts. You have to find the opening, i.e. your turn, and then you retaliate. And I found that so fascinating. And when I actually saw that in Souls-likes, and I looked at the larger genre of action RPGs as a whole, I realized that almost every single action RPG has a similar concept of, it's my turn, it's your turn, it's my turn, it's your turn. And I was like, okay, why the heck did I ever think that, you know, like I needed fast reflexes for things? And again, I covered squad-based shooters, and I covered like action RPGs. So really, action games these days are made with older people in mind. And we can still have a lot of fun playing these games. Like Helldivers 2 is a great example of that. So anyways, quite a long answer to quite the succinct question, if you will. So hopefully you got your answers like right there. How do you keep your attention span on one game at a time? Do you play more than one at a time? How do you keep track of the controls and what you're doing in each one? I actually don't suggest people play one game at a time. And I know I've talked to a lot of people on my Discord about this, and some people are saying, I just can't do it. It's not the same experience. But that's the point of playing multiple games, is it's not the same experience. Because if they all just kind of like blend and bleed together, you're not really playing different games. You're kind of just playing the same experience, but just multiple times across the, different titles. So usually what I do is when I play multiple games, like right now is a really good example, I try to play games that have enough variety in terms of its gameplay so that way I don't feel burnt out and I feel like I'm getting a lot of progress. I mentioned earlier that I'm playing through Hades, so a game that I'm playing through right now as of this recording is Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door. And there are things that I'm kind of cleaning up in some other RPGs that I've played this year, which is why I don't complete them. Another question I'm going to be addressing shortly. I think it's just great to have a variety of games that you play that are of different genres. So one really cool game that I play a lot of the time, especially if I'm just kind of wanting a change of pace, is Vampire Survivors. That is an easy game to just kind of jump into, play for like 10-15 minutes. I have it on my phone, and you can just have a blast like playing that game. Another game that I've been playing is the Nikke game from the developers of Stellar Blade. It's literally Time Crisis on my phone with hot waifus. Why wouldn't I want to play something fun like that? Especially since that's a style of game that's not prevalent these days. Like Time Crisis is not something that a lot of people know about, which is really sad. And so that's kind of like how I see playing video games. Like, bottom line, don't just play one game, play multiple games, but be very mindful of what those side games are so that way you're not going to get burnt out with the main game that you're wanting to play. I think as I'm aging though, like one of the more tougher things to keep track of are where the confirm and cancel buttons are, especially if you're playing games on a Nintendo platform versus the Xbox versus the PlayStation versus PC. Because as you know, Nintendo has the confirm button where circle would be on the PlayStation and I think B would be for the Xbox. So that's confusing a little bit. It's just like more muscle memory than anything, really. But I don't normally have problems remembering like how things control. It's only like when it's been months or years later that does matter. How often do you complete games now? Do you still finish the games you set out to play? Here's another part of that burnout story. So for reviews, I do finish my games because, well, you want to know like how I feel about the whole experience. Super important. Completing games implies that I am literally 100%ing everything, completion lists, doing all these checklists and whatnot. I don't do that at all. I never did that even when I was younger. The main reason why is because for me, I need an excuse to go back to these games that I absolutely love. And so usually when I finish games, I just kind of let them go for a good while, because I think that by having these other aspects of games that are not yet finished, it gives me an excuse to kind of play through them again and kind of re-experience them all throughout. And I think there's something to be said about coming back to games and kind of recognizing again, like, oh yeah, this is actually like a pretty cool thing that I played a long time ago. I'd only complete games if I am really invested in them, or I know that I want to have that full experience right then and there. But that's extremely rare because, like I said, I want to go back to these games and have a really good excuse to do so. I actually did that very recently with Yakuza 5, and it's so much fun just kind of jumping back into Yakuza 5, realizing that you didn't 100% like the taxi racing mini game and stuff, and just kind of doing that and, just really enjoying it and realizing like, this was great. I bet I had a lot of fun when I was growing up and playing these games. Okay, so this next question asks, how do you curate your game choices? Is it me or is it harder to pick something to play? This kind of reminds me of like an earlier question talking about, again, like selecting games to play. And I think like it's harder for us to pick games because we don't have as much time as we had when we were kids. I was talking to somebody the other day where they said like they only had an hour playing video games a day. And I thought to myself, let's take Persona 5 as an example, because that's at minimum a 100-hour game. So that would basically take that person 100 days to finish that game if they consistently play at least an hour a day. And it's really made me think about like how many games out there strive to have hundreds of hours of gameplay for the main story, not realizing that it's kind of aging some people out. And I do believe that everybody should be able to experience video games. And I also think about like a lot of these like Trails fans who are really hardcore into the series, who basically tell people to start from Trails in the Sky first chapter so that they could just have the ability to play Cold Steel 1, which some people have told me like is the one that they're really interested in. And if you think about that, you're asking somebody to play 5 games at top 60, 70 hours each. You know, that's being generous. Meaning that the person who wanted to play the game that they're interested in, you're basically telling them it'll take them like 2 to 3 years to play because you're asking them to start like 5 games ago. And I think part of the reason why it's so difficult to choose to play games is we have to take into account if we're going to be involved and also enraptured and engaged in that game for the long haul. You don't want to start playing a game that's like 100 hours to realize like 50 hours in that you're not going to be into it. And that makes it difficult for a lot of people to process a lot of that stuff. And I think what's best, again, is to try to figure out ways to incorporate different styles of games into, you know, your hobby and stuff. That way you're not kind of burning yourself out. And I think a lot of people who kind of mainline just one game find that they burn themselves out quite a bit, like especially with RPGs, because they are already lengthy experiences. It's very rare for a game to like hold you in its grasp in terms of attention, especially with so many new games coming out recently and stuff. The next question is, how have your opinions and tastes changed over the years? Do you approach games differently now or branch out and try genres of games that you previously disliked? Has anything changed as far as your preferences go in your 40s? Has your preference of the type of game you like playing changed? What's the main appeal of games you look for now that you're older? This is a great question, and technically I could have lumped this in a previous question, but I think this is more different because it's kind of asking if my tastes have changed, and of course my tastes have changed over time. But I will say, to be clear, that JRPGs are still near and dear to my heart. I grew up with games that obviously were purely gameplay driven with barely any story. But then I remember like playing a game like Ninja Gaiden, the trilogy on the NES, and kind of having these cutscenes. And then of course transitioning from there to like something like Final Fantasy, where it's even in a more epic adventure that has like a story that just took you to far off lands. And that's just, there's nothing that really encompasses and copies that sort of experience to me, not even in most action games. And by RPGs, I want to be clear, I'm talking about the entire gamut of RPGs, like tactical, action, turn-based. There's so many out there that it's such a treat, like being able to play so many RPGs. But yeah, like I think like it's weird because when I was younger, I was more selective with the kind of games like I wanted to play. But now as I'm actually getting older, I want a much more varied experience, with some experiences that I normally wouldn't think about and want, like wholesome experiences. You know, something like Murder by Numbers, for example. That's such a really cool game that is really a nonogram game with Phoenix Wright vibes. And I don't think I would have considered playing that game when I was younger because I was all about the bleeding edge, cutting edge graphics, or I wanted like a traditional kind of RPG experience. And I think what's interesting about that is that I recognize that when I like a genre, it's not necessarily the entire genre that I like, it's components of it. So that's when I started thinking to myself, okay, what other genres can have really good story? Okay, it's this, that, and this. Okay, what other genres have really good gameplay? Well, it's this, that, and this. And when I started kind of branching out, it really opened a wide new world of gaming for me that I never really thought was there. There was a time during the PS2 era where I just kind of abandoned games for a little bit. And then when I came back, it was so fascinating and surprising that discovering these new games, and we're talking like games like Persona 4, Digital Devil Saga, a bunch of Atlas titles like the Devil Summoner series that I discovered at the time, Rule of Rose. Those are the kinds of games that I discovered when I kind of left this hobby for a little bit, and it was such a magical experience coming back to it. And so that's why it's kind of important for me now these days to experience a whole wide world of games, even if I feel like I'm not good at them, because there's always guides for games. Like, people always make guides for games. And I want to be clear, like, playing using guides is perfectly acceptable, especially if you don't have a lot of time. I actually learned that from a very old coworker of mine back in 2000. It was Final Fantasy IX that we were talking about back in the day, and he said he had to buy the guide along with the game because he didn't have a lot of time. And at the time, I didn't understand why. And of course, now that I'm in my 40s, I completely understand where he's coming from, because we don't have a lot of time to figure out the nuances of games. But if you're asking me about like what games that I can truly say are some of my favorites that I felt like represent some of my likes in the past, but also the present and the future, I can name two games. And one is Octopath Traveler 2, which was my game of the year in 2023. And the other is Elden Ring. I actually spent almost 30 minutes talking about this game when it first came out back in 2022. And if you're curious about any of these two games, I've actually linked them right now and you're seeing them on the screen. Feel free to check out those videos because I really think these are two games that you'll really enjoy. Thank you very much for everyone's questions again, by the way. Thank you very much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.